Well, good morning and welcome to Coffee with Ken. I'm Ken Biberaj, a managing director at Savills, a leading tenant advisory commercial real estate firm. In the news today, President Biden has warned of a code red moment in climate change as he toured damage in New York City from Hurricane Ida's remnants. And the Commonwealth of Virginia today has taken down the statue of Robert E. Lee in the state capitol. Today's topic is 20 years of the war on terror. We're joined by Paul Reickhoff, founder of Righteous Media, founder of Iraq, Afghanistan Veterans of America, and the host of Independent Americans. Paul, great to see you. How are you?
I'm great, Ken. Good morning. Good morning, everyone watching. I brought my coffee with Ken. Okay,
Good.
so I
How
got.
many cups do you have? Just one.
I have a lot of cups, man. I got two little kids, and it's a pandemic, and I'm an entrepreneur. And this is not a plug, but my Yeti cup is pretty much attached to my hand. And then I don't yet have a coffee with Ken cup, but I do have an Independent Americans coffee cup that I will share with you.
We're going to do a cup swap next time.
And I'll share with you in full disclosure, because this is the times we're in. I have coffee in this one. I have muscle milk in this because I'm trying to stay in shape, and these little boys are kicking my ass. And that's pretty much as close to breakfast as I'm going to get today. I just finished taking out the garbage. I got two sick kids upstairs watching Pets 2, and they may or may not interrupt us. But I'm excited to talk to you and ready to go, man.
Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate you making the time. I mean, we are literally 3 days away from the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attack. So I know you have a lot going on. You've been talking to a lot of folks, so we appreciate you making some time to come on Coffee with Ken. But before we get into that, I'd love to kind of get your kind of quick take on, last 6 months since April, since announcements of our exit from Afghanistan. What's gone through your mind over these last few months? Most in particular, the last 6 to 8 weeks of how our exit happened, and where are you coming down on all this?
Well, as we sit here before the 20th anniversary, it's been a hell of a year and a half for the world, hasn't it? I mean, it's really been a difficult time. And I think coming out of the pandemic, or trying to come out of the pandemic, many of us were wondering, can it get worse? And the reality is yes, especially if we forget. 9/11 is a lot about never forget. And that's a term you hear thrown around. And I think one of the biggest lessons that I want to instill upon people 20 years later is don't forget about foreign policy. Don't forget about national security, which is now very much interwoven with domestic security. So if you talk about the last 6 to 8 months, we're really talking about a year that started with an insurrection. We've seen the rise of Delta. We've seen the pullout of Afghanistan. And we've seen a really challenging time, a scary time. I've got a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and it's a scary time for them. But I think the withdrawal of Afghanistan is something that generally, I supported and many folks supported. But I think the evacuation and the lack of forward planning that really started in April with the announcement and has accelerated, especially after our departure, I think has been a debacle. I think it's been one of the worst marks on our foreign policy history of our time. And I think it's a time, Ken, honestly, where the honor of our country is being challenged. Coming out of 4 years of Trump, where we went against so many of our values, what's happening in Afghanistan that I really want folks to think about is I think it's a betrayal of our values, because we have left so many of our friends to die. We've left so many people that stood up with us. We've left so many people facing what could be a humanitarian disaster. So, you and I are here having coffee and we're safe and warm. But in Afghanistan, anybody who's a journalist, anyone who produces content, musicians, and especially women and girls are being killed. And that's a really, really hard thing to deal with. And we can't just wash our hands of it. We got to be vigilant. We've got to be focused. And that's a big part of my message on this 20th anniversary is that for a long time, Afghanistan became Forgotistan. Yeah. But really, foreign policy became Forgotistan because everyone was so inward focused with Trump and the pandemic that I think we took our eye off the ball. And we've got to get our eye back on that ball. We've got to get focused. And 9/11 is a good reminder to do it.
Yeah. So there's two parts to this, right? There was the kind of more macro, like exit, we should get out of Afghanistan, forever war, this kind of terminology. And then the kind of second part about how we exit, right? Like, what are your thoughts on whether we should be there, should exit, et cetera? And then the second part about like the mechanics of the exit and what just went wrong with Bagram and the exit, and how do you think about this and how should it have been done?
I think one of the most dangerous things you can do in foreign policy is oversimplify. And I think what's happened is a lot of different issues have become conflated over the last 6 months. And I've been a supporter of Joe Biden. I voted for Joe Biden. I'm thankful every day Donald Trump is not president. But I think he's really bungled this. I think it's been a failure of leadership. I think it's been a failure of competence. I think it's been a failure of execution. And those are things we really need our commander in chief to do well at. And I think, the withdrawal was something that, was decided. No matter who it was, Trump or Biden, they decided they're going to pull everyone out. I think you could have made an argument for a small residual force to be able to deal with emerging threats like ISIS-K, to protect women and girls, right, to provide air assets and air cover to prevent the Afghan government from crumbling. I think there was an argument to be made there, but when he said he was going to withdraw, I supported it. I expected an orderly, smart, well-planned withdrawal. Yeah. And what happened instead was a debacle. There's an old saying that failing to plan is planning to fail. Biden made the announcement in April that he was originally going to pull us out on September 11th. And he picked that date and got a lot of flack for it. Then he said, okay, August 31st. And then he picked a date and didn't get everything we needed to get done before that date. So really the way it's unfolded now is we've got these friends who stood alongside of us, who served in uniform, especially served alongside our CIA. They are in a burning building and we're watching them burn. We can't get them out. Our government can't get them out. And they're under tremendously difficult circumstances, terrible circumstances. Human rights violations are happening. And I think that's where people have to keep their focus. There's been a lot of pushback from Democrats, a lot of apologizing for Biden, defending Biden. This is bigger than Biden. This is bigger than Afghanistan. If we watched this unfold and America wasn't involved, a lot of folks, I think, especially on the left, would be urging us to intervene. The Taliban is a nasty group of people that are not going to whitewash themselves and become nice tomorrow. So we've got a real threat on our hands. And I wish I could tell you that it was going to go away soon. I think a lot of folks in the White House would like that to happen. But I think we're in for some very, very rough days and potentially even a need, as Biden has said, to go back into Afghanistan. So here we are again with the president, I think, really in a precarious place of eroding trust. I think Biden's lost a lot of trust here. And I think that's a big problem for him as commander in chief and a big problem for us as a country.
You're a professor now, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, but you're also in history, right? When you think about the national security apparatus and the president's decision making, right? And you think about President Biden, and you take a step back and you think about maybe what's going through his head, whether it's Bay of Pigs or the surge. Is there a kind of macro, I don't want to say distrust, but kind of skepticism of the Pentagon and how decisions are made and whether orders are kind of implemented, right? Like presidents have, for last two presidents have very aggressively to get out of Afghanistan. It hasn't happened, right? Is there an execution challenge? Is there a kind of distrust that they were going to do it, and that why he was holding fast to the 31st and like just ripping the Band-Aid and we're going to get out? Like, how does that work? Like,
I think it's you talk to a lot of leaders from different industries. These are leadership decisions of the highest level. And I think sometimes leaders of both parties hide behind the military. You should be cynical of military recommendations. You should question all of them. But the military's job is to present options to the president, and he chooses. Yeah. And I think Trump did this too often. And I think Biden's been doing it lately too, saying, well, I deferred to the generals. The generals told me. That's not how it's supposed to work. The boss doesn't defer to the junior people in the company to make the final decision. The boss makes the final decision. So Biden made a decision here. He made a decision, I think, a while ago. And I don't think he adapted that decision over changing conditions on the ground. And I want to put a point on it. If they failed to predict, as they say, that the Taliban would storm through the country and take over in a couple of weeks, that's a massive failure, right? And if they failed to predict that, they failed to plan for it, as we approach the anniversary of 9/11, what else might they be missing? So there needs to be accountability. And the way I think it breaks down, either the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, didn't advise him that this was happening. And if that's the case, he should be fired. That's a failure. We should clean house. Or the president heard the advice and didn't listen. It's one of those two things. I don't think there's a third option. And if the president made that decision, which it sounds like he did, he's doubling down on it. He's sticking to it. He is responsible for the consequences that come from that decision. And I really want to focus on one thing. You come from New York. I think we may have met in New York. Competence is a part of the job. You are responsible not just for the decision, but how you execute that decision. When Bill de Blasio says he's going to vaccinate New York, that's great that he's making that decision. He also has a responsibility to ensure that he can vaccinate all New Yorkers. And I think that's where Biden has gotten so much bipartisan criticism on this. You did not have to close down every military asset and run everybody through one civilian airport. And the comparison I always give is, imagine if you told everybody in New York who was not going to be killed by the Taliban, you had to get out of LaGuardia Airport in 30 days. What would that look like, right? We would fire the mayor, we would call for accountability. And that's essentially what happened in Afghanistan. So I think there has to be accountability for that failure to responsibly execute. And you can't spin it. and say, look at how many people we got out. We had to get that many people out because it was so bad. And you don't see the denominator. You hear how many people we got out, but you don't hear how many people we left behind. And the truth is now the State Department doesn't know, the White House doesn't know, and it could be hundreds of thousands of people who could face slaughter. That's how high the stakes are. So I think whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent like me, you've got to hold your commander-in-chief accountable. You've got to hold the national security apparatus accountable. And that's why I think there should be congressional investigations. I also think there should be congressional investigations around January 6th and the insurrection. That's how we learn. That's how we get better. And that's something else we learned from 9/11. I am teaching a class on 9/11 this year. Most of my students weren't born, and I'm assigning them the 9/11 Commission report, which was created so that we could learn the lessons. So 20 years later, I could show my students, what did we do right? What did we do wrong? That's what we have to do as a country. And we shouldn't be afraid of that because of politics or because some people will be held accountable. We should hold people accountable.
So let's talk a little bit more about the exit of allies and what the situation is on the ground. I mean, I'm in Northern Virginia. There's a lot of, folks in the armed forces, veterans who were in this area. And I was catching up with a couple of friends, and they were literally on, WhatsApp, on Signal, trying to coordinate people on the ground to exit. And I was like, are you doing that for work through the pennant? And they're like, no, we're just doing it. What's happening with the veteran community? How connected are they to these allies on the ground? Just to describe the magnitude of this, right? These are people who are translators, who help them, who risk their lives to help our soldiers on the ground. Like, how impactful and connected is the veteran community to this? And what are they doing on their own? I mean, I've heard about this digital Dunkirk, and you're reading a little bit about it, but like, lay out the magnitude of just like what's independently, how successful it is, and what's the kind of situation today, 2 weeks out.
So, over 2 million veterans have served since 9/11. They've been to Iraq, they've been to Afghanistan, Syria, all around the world. And that's where I think, again, a tweak that's critical here. The forever war means we are at war constantly in, theoretically in the name of the attack in 9/11. And it doesn't mean Afghanistan. It means we have troops in Syria, in Iraq, in the Congo right now. People don't know we have, special operations troops in the Congo. We have tens of thousands in Japan and Germany. So the forever war, no matter what Biden says, goes on. And if he says the war in Afghanistan is over, it may be over for our military. It's not over for the Afghan people, and it's not over for our veterans. So how connected are we? We're more connected to people in Afghanistan than I am to you, Ken. Right? I talk to people in Afghanistan more often than I've talked to you. We've been old friends. We live in the same country, right? We text, we email, we're in touch over social media. We share pictures of our friends. We talk about what's going on. We're friends. We're allies. We are former coworkers in battle, right? And I have two of my interpreters that served with me in Iraq who made it out of Iraq. One lives in Connecticut. One lives in Nashville. A third one never got out of Iraq. I don't know what happened to him. So we are that connected in that when the fall started, they were telling us it was happening, and then it evolved into help us. And what happened really, there's a bit of a good news story here that so many veterans that and I know are stepping up and rallying and creating these operation control centers in the living rooms or in the kitchens. But it shouldn't have to be that way. It's happening that way because our government failed to get them out. So the digital Dunkirk, it's a good comparison. Dunkirk was when they famously tried to remove everybody from the beach in World War II before they were overrun. And that's really the imminent threat. Get them off the beach before they're slaughtered. And that's what American veterans feel right now. So they're getting people out, but they're doing it on their own. They're raising money on GoFundMe pages. They're using nonprofits. They're trying to get them around the borders. And they're doing it because the government failed. And that's the betrayal. And I've called Afghanistan the great American betrayal of Afghanistan because of the way we got out. We did not have to leave our friends to die and leave people with real jobs and kids who aren't professionals at this to try to save women and children from slaughter and to save heroic allies and to save, really important here, Ken, American citizens. There are American citizens that are still there that want to get out, that cannot get out. So there's a betrayal there. And I think that's very important for people to understand. It's beyond the politics. It's personal. And it was a promise that we made. I looked across people like you and said, I will protect you when my government leaves. And you trusted me. And when the day came, my government failed you. And I'm trying like hell to reach through the screen to get you to safety, to get your kids to safety. And I can't. And that's why you're seeing a real betrayal, not just of the Afghan people, but of the American veterans and the CIA and the intelligence community and all those people who went to Afghanistan for the last 20 years and made a promise. That promise has been unfulfilled, and that will stain our reputation, not just with the Afghans, but around the world. Think about if we have to go to war with China, if we have to go to war with North Korea, and we say to other countries, stand up with us, stand up with America, we'll protect you. They're going to talk to the Afghans or to the Kurds or to others and say, we don't believe you. We're standing with China, or we're standing with the Taliban. And that's where this is so much bigger than just about Afghanistan. It's about the soul of America. And it's a true gut check moment. And it's not going away just because Biden created a deadline and because the planes are out. Very much for the people on the ground, it is more dangerous, more deadly, and more serious than ever.
And probably having more attention than ever before, to your point about Afghanistan, right? Now there's people.
Well, not anymore. Not anymore. Because here's what happened. A hurricane happened, right? And which is definitely newsworthy. But there was nonstop coverage, and I watched the interview requests on major media networks drop, right? Okay, you want me on Thursday, Friday, Saturday? They're all gone because they're shifting the coverage into something else. Now, we'll get a bit more attention again as 9/11 comes back around. But in many ways, the American public has turned the page. The media assets are gone. You don't have people like Clarissa Ward from CNN on the ground in Afghanistan anymore. Now she's back home. So that will directly impact our connection to it. And that's what we're most worried about. The Afghan people have been betrayed. They've been left behind. And now they're worried they'll be forgotten. And I think that would be compounding this macro foreign policy sin that's happened over the last few months.
So you're a professor now, Professor Paul. You're at Amherst. This is the first time I've seen a course on 9/11 specifically. Tell us, how did it come about? What are you trying to accomplish? How many students do you have? Tell us about the curriculum. What are the main topics you're going to talk about as we lead up to 9/11 itself?
I was very lucky to be able to go to a fantastic liberal arts school in Western Massachusetts called Amherst College. I went there really because I played football. That was my way in. I wasn't at the academic level I probably should have been. But I played football and I really wanted to go there, and I was able to go, and it was like a golden ticket for me. It changed my whole life. I was the first in my family to go to college. Later, I joined the military and did all these other things. So I've always stayed connected to the school because I really feel like it's given me so much, and I want to do what I can to help the next generation of leaders. I stayed in touch with folks there, and they invited me to come back as a visiting professor for the 20th anniversary to teach a class called Understanding 9/11. I was a 9/11 first responder. I served in the military. I worked on national policy and legislation to do things like get health benefits for 9/11 first responders. And I just know this community. So I thought it would be a great opportunity for me to come back to campus and bring the stories of others. Most of my students weren't born on 9/11. So I started with the question, where were you on 9/11? And I ask all your listeners and viewers to think about that. Where were you that moment? Everybody, for the most part, that was alive remembers where they were. 3/4 of my students said, I wasn't born yet. So the way they understand 9/11 is really being shaped by others and being shaped by media and being shaped by pop culture. So I'm going to bring in first-person accounts, military leaders, humanitarians. This week, I brought in Rob Serra, who was a firefighter from the FDNY. His first day on the job was 9/11. So they heard from a man who took a New York City bus with a bunch of other firemen into a burning tower to understand what that was like. We're going to read, we're going to watch, we're going to experience, but really it's about bringing the ground truth understanding of people who were there and exploring things like forever war, the authorized use of military force, the policy decisions that came afterward, the war in Afghanistan, our wrong turn, in my view, into Iraq. And now 20 years later, what's the next 9/11? Is it the pandemic? Is it the insurrection? Is it something yet to come like a cyber attack? But thinking in terms of a moment that will forever change history and forever change everyone's life. The best comparison they have viscerally right now is the pandemic. So they all know where they were that moment they heard school was closing or the pandemic was real. So I want to do what I can to bring that message and those stories back to these students and generate a national conversation. I hope there are a lot more classes on 9/11 because it's often been hijacked. Frankly, the word and the term has been hijacked. And you'll see that more and more with everything from mattress sales to politicians waving a flag saying never forget and then voting against health benefits for firefighters. So it's a good time for reflection. It's a good time for remembering our stories, and that the term is never forget. So I want to help them never forget, but also understand that 9/11, like Afghanistan, is a lot more than just that date.
So as we think back on it, are we safer today than we were on September 8th, 2001?
I don't think so. And here's why. On 2001, my 5-year-old and 2-year-old weren't at risk by getting hit by a plane. I lived in New York. They weren't born, but it was unlikely statistically that they would be hit by a terrorist attack. It's pretty likely they'll get hit by COVID, right? Domestic terrorism is another threat that I think is the number one national security threat. They are more likely to be shot by a domestic terrorist, to be hit by a car bomber, to be swept up in the crossfire than they are to be hit by Al Qaeda. And I think that's an important reframing that the president started on a path down toward, identifying the domestic extremism, white nationalism, the Proud Boys, all the others are the most immediate threat to us and to your family and mine. And I think a reframing of that is very important. I think we did, neutralize much of the threat that emanated from 9/11. We got bin Laden. Those things are important, and they're tactical and sometimes strategic victories. But overall, ask yourself, do you and your family feel safer now than you were 20 years ago? And I think, unfortunately, the answer is probably no.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned foreign policy being forgotten. I think a class like this can obviously lead to a greater discussion on that. How do you think about America's role in the world and foreign policy, and what conversation should we be having? Because you're right, everything is just so focused internally now between the pandemic and infrastructure and everything else going on.
I think lately it probably looks to the rest of the world pretty schizophrenic. It looks inconsistent. And I think that's a real question for everyone listening and watching is what do you think American foreign policy should be? What are our values? You may not want us to be America's policeman, but do you want us to leave women and children to die under the Taliban? Do we want a Taliban state that expands and is funded by Pakistan and becomes a mega state? I think those are the real questions we have to ask. And the president, for the most part, lays out those value sets. And the Biden doctrine has been proclaimed to be dramatically different from the Trump doctrine. We will see engaging with NATO and getting back into the climate accords and so many things like that, I think are important and dramatic shifts. Also value shifts like removing the Muslim ban, allowing trans people to serve openly in the military. Those are all interconnected. So I think there has to be a recentering of American values. I thought Joe Biden was the better alternative to do that. But I think we have to be vigilant in holding him and others accountable to true American values. And one of those values is not leaving our friends behind, about honoring our word, about recognizing that we have a moral obligation, I think, to make a difference where we can, how we can. And that might be for our neighbors after, Hurricane Ida hits, or it might mean in the Middle East if a minority group is at risk of being slaughtered. So I think it's dynamic. And I think what I really want Americans to think about is what do they think it should be, especially around 9/11, because that's kind of a gut check time for all of us. And I talk on my show a lot about rejecting the two parties. 40% of Americans are independent or unaffiliated. That's why I call my show Independent Americans. I think that we have 19 options to buy a computer table for your office, but we only have 2 options for political parties. In places like New York, you have 1 option. And I think we deserve more options, and we should challenge the status quo more. And there is an emergence of unaffiliated independents, moderates for the most part, especially on foreign policy, that don't have a home. And I think we're going to look to leaders to represent those values. And in the absence of that leadership, it's up to you in your community, on your show, in your family dinner table to define what American values mean on foreign policy. And that really often comes down to the time. What do you spend your time on? What does your family watch? What do you talk about? What do you donate money to? What do you volunteer to support? Is it Israel? Is it the genocide in Rwanda? Is it something else? What is it that you support? And I think we need more Americans involved in foreign policy because the pandemic kind of brings it home. That's where the two are intertwined, because the pandemic is also about foreign policy. It is also about national security. And that is, I think, an important component that gets underappreciated. It's not just a public health issue. It's a national security issue. When 40% of the military hasn't been vaccinated, that's a national security priority. And I hope that conversation emerges much more in the next couple of months.
Last 2 questions and I'll let you go. Talk to us about what you're thinking and seeing on the ground in terms of refugees coming to this country out of Afghanistan, and what kind of opportunity maybe that presents for us in terms of the eyes of the world looking at America.
I think this is a time to make a wrong less wrong. We can't save them all, but we have been able to save many. And the question is, do we commit as a nation now to wrap our arms around them and help them succeed here? There are families that are resettling right now in your town and mine and everywhere around this country. And that's happened before. It will happen again. That is the essence of American values, I think, is giving people a chance at this life here. So it's been called Operation Resettle Allies, taking that digital Dunkirk and now shifting it into helping resettle families. And it's been inspiring. It's been great. We need more government support. We need more philanthropic support. We need more corporate support because it is a national security imperative, but it's also about strengthening our country. 20 years from now, these kids that are getting off planes at Dulles and LaGuardia are going to be members of Congress. They're going to be Olympians. They're going to be, senior leaders in our military. My interpreter who lives in Nashville now, his kids are in high school. His son's a linebacker on the football team in Nashville, Tennessee, and his daughter's a singer. I mean, they're doing well, and that's the future that this country does still hold, but it's up to each of us to step up and donate. I recommend folks check out Team Rubicon. Is a great charity that's led by veterans that's helping with the resettle effort. You don't have to be a veteran to join that organization, and there are others, but I think there's a way to get involved. If you want to know what to do on 9/11 and really honor the spirit of 9/11, that's part of it, is recognizing the best parts of America and how some of the really beautiful parts of America did shine in those darkest moments, the way we came together, the way we rallied, and the way we looked out for others. We can bring bits of that back. And I think resettling our Afghan allies, friends, guests is maybe one of the most urgent missions for all Americans right now.
So last question, you mentioned 2 million folks had served in Iraq and Afghanistan 20 years after 9/11. What's the kind of, morale check on our armed forces and veterans? I mean, how are people feeling? Whether you're a vet,
terrible right now. The Afghanistan betrayal, the failure to recognize how bad that was for so long, compounded by the pandemic, compounded by 9/11's anniversary, compounded by the division, is very tough right now. And that's the reality. I say that because it's true. And it's my job as an advocate to represent that. Not everyone is challenged right now, but the overall stress level, my dashboard is off the charts. And we're going to need folks to rally around our community now, involve them. They need hope, they need connection, they need family, and they need leaders who understand. My 2-year-old is walking up to me right now, and he is, in my view, what it's all about. But know that there are a lot of vets, just like others, who've had a hard couple of years. We lost more vets to COVID than maybe any other population, especially World War II vets. So they're under a lot of stress, but they represent the next generation of leaders. They represent the best of us. They represent people you can count on when the next hurricane comes. And I always say, veterans are not a charity, they're an investment.
Yeah.
And it's one of America's best investments. And if you make that investment, it's going to help us in ways we can't even calculate. The same folks that served in Afghanistan were on the front lines of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And are now in the front lines of Ida and are going to be on the front lines of the next thing. And we, invite everyone to be a part of that in the same way, frankly, they haven't been for the last 20 years. So it's a chance for a makeup call for all Americans. Get involved now, and we can be one team, one fight, even just a little bit like we were after 9/11.
Amazing. Well, look, Paul Reickhoff, thank you so much for coming on. Appreciate it. Congrats on the new gig at Amherst. And thank you to everyone for tuning in today. Our next Coffee with Ken will be next week, September 15th, with Tony Williams, former mayor of DC. Thanks, Paul. Good to see you.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye.